Welcome, I'm Jeff Carter. I go by he, him with Seattle City Club. Welcome to this virtual Civic Bootcamp on Native American leadership in the Salish Sea region and our first webinar on tribal action in government today. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that Seattle City Club is a small nonprofit with a big mission to strengthen our community through conversations with community leaders on critical topics like this one, and encourage civic engagement. So please consider supporting us to continue programs like this by making a donation on our website, seattlecityclub.org. So with that, I'd like to welcome Leonard Forsman, chairman of the Suquamish tribe, to offer his opening statement and land acknowledgement. Chairman Forsman.
Hema, Hakshla Tugwala Apu, Leonard Forsman, Gui, Teetsta, Suquamish tribe. I'm Leonard Forsman, and I'm chairman of the Suquamish tribe, and I'd like to thank you all for coming to this event to learn a little bit more about our people of the Salish Sea. We have a lot of discussion about our relationship to this ancestral landscape that goes back many, many generations. And you may have many have heard of the 7 generations concept as well. That's kind of something the North American Indians have adopted, that we think about the 7 generations before and 7 generations after. So that spirit, we'll just do a short blessing. So I'd like to thank the Creator for this day and for the world we live in and for the people around us and our families, our elders, our children, and those who have gone before us, those who will come in front of us, and coming ahead in future generations, and also a blessing on our elders, our veterans, our health workers, our government workers, and the students who are graduating and their families, and those who have recently lost loved ones. Let's put a prayer up for them. Amen. And this concept of land acknowledgement is one that's still being sorted out. I just think that we all want to honor the ancestors of this land, of the Salish Sea, of the Central Salish Sea, and all of us that are, carrying on the obligations that we took on when we were born into our families to take care of ourselves in this land and leave something for the next generation and try to live in a sustainable way. So with that, I'd just like to welcome everybody here to this virtual space, and hope that we can all maybe come out with a better understanding of each other and our values and traditions. So with that, I'll hand it back to our moderator.
Thank you, Chairman Forsman. Now I would like to hand it to our moderator, Ernie Rasmussen, Tribal Liaison with the Washington State Department of Commerce, to begin the panel discussion. So Ernie, take it from here.
Wawan Mitch, Wawanan, Poso on it not, Yom Kismo Matsit Yom Kon. Thank you and hello and welcome everybody. It's my honor to spend this time with you. I'm extremely honored to be able to have been asked to facilitate and moderate this conversation, and to sit alongside such talented and driven leadership in Indian country. And so again, it is my honor. I'd like to begin with, just asking, some of our those that have joined us today to offer a quick introduction of themselves. And then we'll follow that up with a presentation from our panelists. So Representative Deborah Lekanoff, I'd like to go to you first for an introduction of yourself, please.
Thank you, Ernie. It's so wonderful to see you. And thank you, Chairman Forsman, for those beautiful words. We always go back to our ancestors, and it just warms my heart to see you and Abigail here. I am Deborah Lekanoff. It's my given English name. I am the Washington State Representative for the 40th Legislative District. I am currently the only Native American to serve in the state legislature, but my arms are wide to all of my colleagues throughout the House and the Senate who take on this responsibility as seriously as I do. It's an honor to sit with Chairman Forsman of the Suquamish Nation and my wonderful friend, Abigail Acknowledgment. It's a pleasure to be here, Ernie. Thank you for inviting me, Jeff.
Thank you, Representative Lekanoff. We're really proud to have you here. Chairman Forsman, again, it's my honor to introduce you to the this larger group. And I would ask you for a few words of introduction from your position.
How to watch Chalup. Leonard Forsman. I'm chairman of the Suquamish tribe and president of affiliated tribes and Northwest Indians, and been involved with cultural resources for a long time. I started out in our museum as a researcher, and got on tribal council kind of by accident in 1987. Served on council for over 30 years, half of that as chairman since '05, and worked both for the tribe and then later for an archaeologist, doing a lot of work in Puget Sound in the Northwest, and then came back to be our first full-time chairman in '05 and been there ever since. I've been appointed by President Obama to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and was on there for 7 years, and had some opportunity to talk a lot about some of the issues that we'll be talking about today. And just like to thank you all for having me, and the rest of our panel, which is very exciting to me. And Ernie, appreciate you volunteering to be our moderator.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. My honor again. Thank you again for your leadership, not only at the Suquamish tribe, but at the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and bringing us together regionally to advance our initiatives and issues to the national level. So again, Mitch Wewanen to that. Miss Abigail Lekanoff, it really is my pleasure to spend some time with you today, and asking you to offer an introduction. I'm looking forward to learning more about your work and working alongside you. So would you mind offering a few words of introduction, please?
Sure. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to this incredible organization that I've watched from afar, haven't been able to participate as much in, and I'm really glad to be here today. And thank you so much, Ernie, for inviting us here and being the moderator of what to me is like two tribal leaders here in Washington State that I look towards for guidance and inspiration, and whose leadership that I am very blessed to follow. So I feel very privileged to be here with Representative Lekanoff and Chairman Forsman. I'm Abigail Lekanoff. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma on my father's side, but I was born and raised in the heart of Alaska amongst my mother's people, the Upper Otna Athabascan people. I greet you from my offices here at the Seattle Indian Health Board, where I serve as the executive vice president of an organization that serves American Indians and Alaska Natives living in urban King County, but we also serve everybody the Native way. In that role, I am blessed to direct our research and public health division, the Urban Indian Health Institute, where I am working to do everything we can to combat the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 within our communities, specifically around the area of what we call decolonizing data, making sure information is for our people, by our people. I'm also a mom of 2 sons, and that also drives my work. And I'm blessed to also work as an artist and a poet, incorporating all of that within our public health work. So it's an honor to be here with you today and to share some of the stories of the strength and resiliency of the urban Indian population, those of us who live off tribal lands in urban areas, but are tribal people regardless of where we live.
Thank you, Abigail. And again, I'm looking forward to this conversation today. As Native Americans, we don't have to look very far to find purpose in our meaning in our life, and so much of that has been handed down to us from our ancestors, and the responsibilities that we have to honor them. Chairman Forsman, in that vein of that responsibility that we have to our ancestors and the sacrifices they made, would you? My understanding is you've got a presentation on the importance of tribal sovereignty that you'd like to give to us.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and do a little presentation here, give a background of our tribe and some of the things that are very important to us here in the central Puget Sound, Salish Sea. Still getting used to all those things. So first slide, just to introduce myself again. Here in our council chambers on the Port Madison Indian Reservation, which is Suquamish and Indianola are 2 of the towns that we have that are incorporated not incorporated, but established here. We're old Mosquito Fleet ferry docks on our reservation here across from Seattle. So I can look out the window now. I'm fortunate to be able to see North Seattle from here. So we've got a strong connection, of course, with the city. Next slide. So the word Suquamish comes from the word Desukwub, which is the people of the clear salt water. And this was a place along the Agate Passage, which separates the Kitsap Peninsula from Bainbridge Island, and was this place that the name for the village at Old Man House, one of the largest winter houses in the Northwest, was built. And so the name of our people comes from the site of one of our largest winter villages in our ancestral territory. Next slide, please. So we probably heard of Chief Seattle. That's the namesake of the city. Chief Seattle signed the treaty for us in 1855. His mother was from a village on the White River, the Duwamish River system, near what the present day city of Kent. His father was from here at Suquamish at Old Man House. He was a strong leader in the area, born in 1786, and was a young boy in 1792 when Captain Vancouver, the British exploration expedition, came off and anchored off of Bainbridge Island, and was there to witness the first trading relationship established with the British explorer at that time. And after that, he became a war leader in an intertribal war, and as a young man, and then he was elevated to the chief of the tribe after his military career, and he kind of went into more diplomacy as more and more exploration and trade came to the area, primarily through the Hudson's Bay Company, who came in the 1830s, and then later with the Oregon Trail being established, more settlers coming into the area, which led to the signing of the Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855, which established our reservation and reserved many of the rights that we're continuing to fight for today and protect today that are enshrined in the treaty, in that agreement where we gave up our land in exchange for a reservation and certain reserve rights that existed prior to the treaty and we're continuing to fight for and preserve today. Next slide. So here's a picture of where the Port Madison Indian Reservation is. You can see in the red there across from Seattle. Chief Seattle had strong connections on both sides of the water, and negotiated hard on behalf of our tribe to establish this reservation to be the home for the Indian people of the Central Sound. Next slide. So we continue to depend on the Salish Sea for a lot of our excuse that phone, sustenance and cultural food, medicine, we call it, salmon, crab, and things like that. Of course, prior to contact, this was the way we survived and thrived, I should say. We gathered enough food to store for the winter time, and then had our ceremonial activities in the winter, and then we went out in the spring and summer and traveled and maintained our social and economic connections with other tribes and gathered more food. And then towards the end of the summer, fall, we have to start storing up more so we could support that winter ceremonial. Winter ceremonials were a lot of renewal ceremonies, thanking the Creator for the things that we have and the gifts that we get, and from the sea and from the land. And we also were very respectful of not wasting food, of being very respectful of the spirit of the salmon and the food that we in the land, because we really believe that our people believe that everything has a human element to it. So it has a soul and a sense of justice, essentially. So you need to take care of things or we quit coming back. And it's something we need to get more back to, is being respectful of the water and those things that we rely on so much for our way of life. It's seriously in danger now. Next slide. So we have our traditions that continue, the canoe journey, our language programs, our cultural programs, and ceremonial activities have had a great resurgence. We've been going through a hard time now because of the pandemic. We haven't been able to gather. And so we're trying to hopefully get back to restoring some of that, back to our, continuing our resurgence and the commitment that we have to preserving our way of life and our traditions. Next slide. So here's our tribal council. We're a 7-member tribal council elected every 3 years on staggered terms. And we have about 1,200 members. And we have we had an 8,000 acre reservation, and it was allotted after the treaty was signed, and in an effort to assimilate our people. And that a lot of that land's been lost. We have a checkerboarded reservation, kind of a minority on our own reservation. We're outnumbered about 10 to 1 now because a lot of that land was lost. But we've been able to restore a lot of our land by purchasing it back. So we've been aggressively purchasing land back on the reservation. So we probably own about, either the tribe or individual people own about over half the reservation now. So that's the good thing. And the tribe owns a couple thousand acres of that. When I started back in the 80s, we probably had 100. So we've been able to really aggressively try to restore our reservation. To be enrolled in Suquamish, you need to be a certain amount of blood quantum, and then also either Suquamish or Duwamish descendancy. So you need to descend from Suquamish or Duwamish, and then for automatic adoption, and then you have to have a 1/8 blood quantum, and then you can also be adopted if you're a quarter Native American, but you have to be voted in. So it's kind of an interesting question about enrollment that I think is important for people to know, that we're really based on kinship. Tribes are families that are together, that we're all related in some way or another, and we work together as families would have done pre-contact. And so there's a lot of tradition around our names and who our ancestors are and who the people were that prominent within the tribe. Next slide. Okay, I think that's it for me. There's a lot more to cover, but I don't want to take up more time, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to our moderator. Thank you.
Well, Chairman Forsman, before I let you off the hook here, I kind of want to ask a question related to the meaning of a sovereign nation. Would you mind kind of expanding on that meaning and what that means for the relationship between tribes, the Suquamish tribe, and specifically your local communities, state and federal governments?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer in some level, because a lot of when we answer that question, we sometimes answer it from in a context of contact, dominant Indian law and culture against a non-Indian culture. So as you know, this gets complicated. But essentially, we were nations pre-contact, obviously. And we had territory that we managed with other tribes around us. So we were self-governing. So once the treaty was signed, we made certain agreements that we would move to the reservation and we would cede our lands. Now, this was done in a context of international diplomacy, because the United States wanted to prove up to the British and other nations that we got Aboriginal title transferred, so they could stand up in an international arena and say, this is the United States. This is the United States of America. And they go, well, what's your claim? Well, we have a treaty with the tribe that owned it before. So they were acknowledging us as the title holders. So once that treaty was signed, then that established this relationship is still ongoing. And I don't want to speak for every tribe in the nation, and I can't. But essentially, from our perspective, the the big change that came in the relationship was for Suquamish was the Bolt decision. And the Bolt decision came down in 1974 and was affirmed in 1979 that acknowledged that the tribes in Puget Sound and the coast and what we call Western Washington were entitled to half of the harvestable salmon in the Puget Sound and on the coast, et cetera. Columbia River was a different case, but essentially that concept, and became co-managers of the resource. Mm-hmm. And so Judge Bolt said the state of Washington has screwed this up so bad, they obviously cannot manage it. The tribes have been managing it for thousands of years. They need to be part of the management system. It recognized, there were other places that we were recognized, but this was a big decision that was made under the fishing rights, treaty rights concept. So that's when it kind of got really acknowledged within the non-Indian world. We've always had it. We've always been self-determining, but we've been facing assimilation, boarding schools, land alienation, stereotypes, all these things to assimilate us and make us not feel Indian and not be tribal, and telling our parents and our grandparents that it's not good to be tribal. So we've been pushing back, and we've had to go through the courts to get these things established. So we're a self-governing nation. There's a lot of Indian law around it. There's the whole concept of the domestic sovereign nation. So we're kind of like a state in a way, but a lot different. But it's similar in that oftentimes the federal government will have a relationship with the state, and we say, well, you need to have that same relationship with the tribe, or better, because they predate the state, and we have a treaty relationship. Now, not all tribes have treaties. Some have executive orders and other arrangements, but similar concepts. So that's the best I can do.
Well, that's a great. I love the foundation that you went from. In that, again, we had there was land, there was a co-management of the land, even with your neighboring tribe. You had resources, you manage those resources. You had a governing systems. And there was cooperation among those tribes to govern, to manage resources, and we go back to that now in that co-management of resources. And so it does come full circle. It has been cyclical, and so so thank you for that explanation, Rep. Lekanoff. I understand that you may have a presentation that kind of helps build on this idea of tribal sovereignty and how the Washington State Legislature works within that arena.
I did, Ernie. It's so good to have you to be here today, and thank you for that question. Unfortunately, my presentation went download, but I can speak to the conversation and expand upon Chairman Forsman's good words. Mr. Chairman, when I host a 101 on tribal sovereignty with my fellow legislative colleagues, you'll find me knocking on your door, Mr. Chairman, and saying, come and speak for us and with us and help us better understand. In my role, and I see Mr. Chairman came off mute a little bit. I bet he was going to say anytime, right?
Well, I know your knock now.
I have to say, I shared earlier, my name is Deborah Lekanoff. I'm the only Native American to serve in the state legislature, but I come behind the pathways of incredible leaders before me. The wonderful Senator Claudia Kaufman, who was the only woman in the first woman in the Senate. I come between Lois Stoit, who comes from a Spokane Native American woman who served right after the Bolt decision from the Spokane Nation. And those of you who have worked with Senator John McCoy and saw his 20 years of service that he provided to the state legislature, both in the House and the Senate, these Native American leaders in the state legislature cleared a pathway and left a couple branches for me to work through. These tribal leaders who worked in the state legislature and who were elected really walked in two worlds. And I go back to the teachings that I learned from Senator Kaufman and from Senator McCoy. They said, Deborah, you're going to come into a world that they're going to want to learn more from you. And you'll need to spend a majority of your time in the state legislature educating, and educating. Legal terminology is important in the state legislature. The teachings that you bring, Deborah, after working underneath tribal chairmen such as Chairman Forsman of the 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington state, the 57 tribes within the Pacific Northwest, and the 571 tribes in the nation are going to be important for you as a state representative. But Senator McCoy also taught me something important. Not only is words important, but knowing how to walk in two worlds. In one world, I'll be wearing my moccasins because I know who I am and where I come from. In the other foot, I'll be wearing, and we don't wear high heels anymore because of COVID, Abigail. We'll be wearing our workout tennis shoes in the other side, the Patty Murray tennis shoe on the other side. But you learn to walk in two worlds as a state legislator. The opportunity that I also brought from learning from Senator McCoy and from Senator Kaufman was that I also have a fiduciary responsibility to my urban Native organizations and to my urban Native people. And those are the people who live off reservation, who rely upon the state and federal government and local government to have good relationships with. And that is where Abigail, Ernie, and I all fall into that same world. Ernie and I and Abigail come from different places in Indian country. Abigail and I share the bloodlines from Alaska. Ernie, you come from the east of the mountains towards the Wapato. Yes. Yeah. And so we live in this great state of Washington, but we walk among the lands that Chairman Clattersby talked about. We walk along among the ancestors of the Washington tribes. So Senator McCoy and Senator Kaufman built this pathway and shared incredible teachings with me, along with my tribal leaders. So for 20 years, I've been fitted with a moccasin on one shoe and that white tennis shoe on the other, balancing how I make decisions. As a state legislator, it's unique for me to sit on the floor of the people's house. I literally sit in the middle of the floor of the people's house, and Abigail and Leonard and Ernie have seen me walk this fine balance. In my world, I have to understand the Republican, the Democratic, the Senate, and the House positions. I need to be able to find that great balance. And it can be challenging at times. But I believe that the teachings that I learned in Indian country of realizing that at the end of the day, you were put in this position as a decision maker. And my ancestors' teachings, as Chairman Forsman shared, is entwined within my 7 generations of decision making. My matriarchal role that Abigail shared in our cultures rises me up to that natural leadership role. But it also teaches me in the state legislature, which is a little unique, Chairman Forsman, that I will not be making decisions and based on what biennium and budget process I need to follow. I'll actually be looking towards making decisions in the state legislature that are generational, because I know that the decisions I make as a state legislature are going to impact everybody who calls Washington State home. The 7 generations of decision making really falls upon that matriarch role that's been passed down through my bloodlines, of having a hand in front of me where my aunties have taught me to make these decisions, and a hand behind me for the young children yet to come. Washington State legislature is an interesting place, and I decided to run based off what I learned from my own culture, but what I've learned from the Washington tribes and the tribes across the nation. We must work together to make a better future. Washington State must acknowledge the treaty rights. They must honor the tribes of all 29 federally recognized tribes. We must acknowledge the territorial rights of those tribes around us, such as Umatilla and Warm Springs and Nez Perce. But I also must recognize my responsibility as a Washingtonian representative to Ernie and Abigail and myself, to those who have learned to call this place home. I must look to our urban areas, which many of you may not know, and Abigail, correct me if I'm wrong, but Seattle is one of the largest in the Pacific Northwest behind LA that has a population that Ernie and Abigail and I are part of. We call this great state home. So I, as a Washington representative, lean to Abigail and I invite her to my decision-making table and to Ernie and say, how do I help that population? Many of you know in the Seattle City Club, we are the ones that are here with you. Your role, I believe, as a state legislator, is to honor the sovereign relationship that Suquamish and the 28 federally recognized tribes have, but to also honor the relationship that our urban organizations and our urban Indians have within this place. So really, in closing, it is a unique role that I get to have. I'm honored that the tribes have allowed me to be able to sit in a place that allows me to work with them to create decisions that honor the co-management, that honor the federally recognized tribes, that honor how we can grow together. And I'm thankful for the urban organizations who also sit at my kitchen table, who work with me to make sure that I have programs within the state government that honor their relationship as a Native American and as a sovereign person, but also as a person who also calls Washington State home. So I'll turn that over to you, Ernie.
Rep. Lekanoff, thank you so much for, kind of sharing the challenge of walking with a foot in both worlds. It is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Some of us are more equipped to do it, have had more experience, have had more support along the way in understanding how to navigate the strategies to support, that challenge of being in two places at once. And some of us aren't so fortunate. Some of our Native American brothers and sisters have not been as fortunate as us to understand how to play that, how to have that balance, and they've suffered for it, and they've had a real challenge. And I think this is kind of a really great segue over to Abigail with, and some of the work that she's doing as an advocate for Native health in an urban setting and across the nation. And to share us with your experiences of working across multiple sectors of to address health equity and how this, that dynamic can inform your work and gives it purpose. And would you mind sharing with us some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. And it's always, kind of gets me fired up to hear my tribal leaders speaking of tribal sovereignty, what that means, how it's implemented, and how it is used to ensure the health and well-being of our people. And that is the work that I get to do here at the Seattle Indian Health Board. This morning, I walked in and I was screened at the door by a Nez Perce tribal member. I stopped and chatted with a relative or a patient of ours who was a Blackfeet tribal member, talked to a nurse who's from Navajo, and then met with my staff who were Omaha and Pawnee, all in the space of less than 5 minutes. So we are intertribal people living in these areas and urban settings and also across the state of Washington. With that, as I'm a Pawnee tribal member, I come from Alaska. This is not my traditional homelands, but as the chairman did the talking about land acknowledgements and how, we're trying to decide how those are actually working outside of Indian country. I was taught by my elders that I acknowledge the land that I'm on and I have a responsibility to that land and to those people, the first peoples of this nation, of this land. And so as a Native person, as an Indigenous person, I see myself in responsibility to my community. And there's no greater gift than to know what your responsibility is. Here at the Seattle Indian Health Board, we serve more than 70% of our patients are American Indian or Alaska Native. We also serve many other people the Native way. And the expression of tribal sovereignty right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic have been incredible. We know that as Native people, as a result of ongoing oppression, the colonization that started more than 500 years ago and the continued attempts to eliminate us from this land as a way to get access to our resources and to not comply with our treaty obligations. As a result of that, we have very high rates of disease within our communities, including those underlying risk factors for death of COVID-19 or being in the hospital, including diabetes, obesity, cancer, asthma. And we saw that when COVID-19 hit our communities. Advocates like myself have been screaming from the rooftops for years that the chronically underfunded Indian Health Service, which funds the Seattle Indian Health Board, is also part of the funding that exists out on the chairman's reservation and on the reservations across this state. we have been advocating for the full funding of the Indian Health Service, which comes from the federal government. And we have never seen that happen ever since its inception in the 1950s. The Indian Health Service is part of our treaty rights. It provides the funding and also in some places direct health care. And they also provide funding to urban Indian areas like Seattle, which has very high numbers of intertribal folks like myself. And as a result of the chronic underfunding, we have not always been able to do more than treat the immediate symptoms that somebody has. We can help put a cast on a broken leg, but we can't necessarily address the underlying risk factors of what causes diabetes at such high rates within our communities. And when COVID-19 hit, folks like myself knew we were going to see an incredible disproportionate impact in Indian country. My team and I got ready because what we knew is we were going to be dealing more with deaths than we were going to be dealing with those that lived. And the very initiation of this pandemic and the first couple of months, that's what we saw. An example of that is here at the Seattle Indian Health Board. We ran out of PPE. Seattle was the epicenter of COVID-19 at the very beginning. We were quickly kind of overrun by folks who were looking, who were concerned they had COVID-19, who did have COVID-19, and quickly we ran out of PPE. Executive leadership like myself were washing scrubs at home. For our staff, we had docs who were sewing their own masks because we had run out. We didn't have all the surgical masks we needed. We were trying to get everybody in masks. And we put out calls to our state, county, and federal partners. And when we finally get a big box in the mail and we open it up, we're hoping for masks. What we found in it instead was body bags. To this day, nobody will say which federal agency, we don't know where it came from. But it was very telling to me in that is what Native people over the course of the colonization and the inception of the Indian Health Service and others, we have gotten the resources to bury our people, but we have not gotten the resources to ensure they have thriving, successful, healthy lives. I saw that box as a metaphor for what was happening. And you know who gave us PPE first? 8th generation, owned by the Snoqualmie tribe, came through with 10,000 surgical masks that they got from their manufacturer in China before we got it from anywhere else. Indian country and Native people stepped up for our people. We saw tribal leadership like Chairman Forsman, like others at the federal level, pushing the federal government for the proper allocation of resources and the packages for COVID-19 that came out, CARES Act, the American Recovery Act. The funds in there are a direct result of tribal sovereignty and tribal leadership like Chairman Forsman. And then here in Washington State, we saw leadership from you, Ernie, and from Representative Lekanoff, who recognized that the urban Indian population and the tribes weren't always getting what they needed. And so you worked to get us funds that came to Washington State. That was in recognition of tribal sovereignty, of the responsibility of governments to Native people as a result of our treaties and living on our land. Regardless of where you are in the United States, you are on Indian land. And so you work to do that. And as a result of the funds that we actually got at the Urban Indian Health Institute, we were able to put out the very first in the nation what our community's perceptions, beliefs, and attitudes were around the COVID-19 vaccine. And we were able to get resources. I remember getting from Swinomish tribe, we heard from them, they're like, can we take your materials you created for the urban Indian population and adapt them? I was like, anything that you have, anything you want of ours is yours. That is our responsibility as urban Indian people, as tribal people on your land, to provide any resources we have and to provide any support, because we know you do the same for us. We saw tribal sovereignty when we got vaccines as urban Indian healthcare providers, both on reservations and in urban areas. We had the ability, unlike this anywhere in the state or in the county, to determine who got vaccinated. The Seattle Indian Health Board was the very first to vaccinate Seattle public school teachers before anybody else, after the mandate from the governor came through to go back in the schools. I know that Chairman Forsman and his teams did the exact same thing in their county. Indian country not only vaccinated our people, but we recognize we are part of a community. The health of Native people in this community is the health of all Washingtonians. And so we vaccinated other people other than just Native people, and we did better than the state did. And right now, nationally, American Indians and Alaska Natives have the highest vaccination rate of any race or ethnic group. That is a result of implementation of our treaty rights as Indian healthcare providers. We, when given the resources, when given the opportunity, and when the states and the counties don't get in our way, we can do incredible things that not only move our people out of just suffering health disparities, but move them into thriving. We can do that when we have the partnerships and the resources, and always the upholding of tribal sovereignty. And every single person here in Washington is like me and has a responsibility to this land and to these tribes. And I highly suggest you start looking at how can you fulfill that responsibility.
My goodness, Abigail, I'm ready to blow through a wall after listening to you. Thank you so much. Those are just incredible words. Just as on a personal anecdote, again, you both Rep. Lekanoff and yourself have mentioned, that we are from a different place. Washington is not our homelands. This is not our ancestral land. And I did not consider myself a Washingtonian until just recently, when I had a kind of a healthcare crisis in my family, and I knew I was going to have to depend on Indian Health Services, for God forbid. And I was worried that my daughter was going to be in a situation where we were not going to be able to address that health challenge. Yet here in Washington State, through the systems that are here, she received the service quickly. She was, in a matter of weeks, we were able to take care of it. And it wasn't, of course, it was a non-life-threatening condition. But at that point, it caused me to pause and reflect. Number one, I'm fortunate to be born Native American. Number two, I'm fortunate to be born Native American in this day and age. And number three, I'm fortunate to be Native American in Washington State. And I know that not every state has this same level of care, has this same level of duty to their tribal partners, those sovereign nations. But there's been such a presence here in Washington State, such a strength of tribal voices, that I'd like to, I'd like to go back to Rep. Lekanoff. And I see she's chatting. So I want to go back. I want to go back to Rep. Lekanoff quickly and ask about that continued voice of strength that informs this partnership with the sovereign tribes of Washington State and those populations that are not part of that. And I'd like to ask you to speak on some of the most recent legislation and how you see it will affect not only tribes, but non-tribal and non-native attitudes towards tribes in the Native American community. Would you mind sharing some of your thoughts on that, please?
No, thank you so much. And, Abigail, your work and the heartfelt work that our Native organizations did for our communities will not be forgotten. You're part of the story and you're part of the messaging. And it really broke my heart hearing about the box that you received, and that quote will stay with me forever. The Washington State has had such a unique relationship with our federally recognized tribes, and part of that has fallen to the shoulders of 3 different Native American legislators, of engaging and committing our time in the House, 98 House of Representatives, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, 40 plus in the Senate, again, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Our Native American issues, as I was taught, are not an R or a D issue similar to the salmon. It is a I issue. This is a Native American issue that we should all take responsibility and acknowledge that relationship to, as the first Washingtonians and as the first Americans. The opportunity of engaging with the Republican and Democratic side on Native American matters, whether it's Native American mascots, whether it's consultation with Washington tribes or tribes who have territorial rights, whether it's preserving the salmon as a being responsible to the treaty rights. This is a Native American matter that impacts Democrats and Republicans, and we should be collaborating together. We also need to acknowledge that our responsibility in relationship to our federally recognized tribes is just not the relationship between the governor's office and our federally recognized tribes. There is a trust responsibility to honor the federally recognized tribes from the state legislature. There's a government-to-government consultation process that occurs through the Centennial Accord with our federally recognized tribes. But in the Millennium Signature of the Centennial Accord, which is now 30 years old, and it's 12 years ago in the Millennium Agreement, the state legislature signed that same Centennial Accord, which honors the government-to-government relationship with the sovereign nation. And I truly believe in my role as a state legislator that I want to be able to preserve and build that implementation. If you can let her know, that would be great. Oh, great, thank you, yes. Emma, hold on just a minute. Did you put the card in there? If you can do that. Sorry, juggling momhood and reporting to all of you.
Okay.
I think it's really important for us to understand underneath the Centennial Accord, which is an agreement between the state legislature, the governor's office, and the federally recognized tribes, that this is a mechanism and a table where we can engage and consult on the top issues. I believe it's important for the state legislature to fully implement that. And in my tenure as a representative, I hope to engage with the legislature, engage with the governor's office, and honor the treaty tribes to begin that, honor our Washington tribes to be able to further that relationship. As I look towards Abigail and my relationship and responsibility to our urban organizations, I also want to create a window and a place and a kitchen table, Abigail, as we're used to saying, for our urban organizations to be able to engage with our state legislature and the governor's office on our relationship with our Native American communities. And many of you will think to that and look at equity and diversity as that maybe how it intertwines to our urban organizations and our federally recognized tribes. And in my teachings, I say that the equity and diversity momentum that's growing now is a part of that conversation. But first and foremost, we have a relationship with our federally recognized tribes as sovereign nations. And we have a relationship to our urban organizations and our urban populations as the first Americans. And so we rise in equity and diversity, but our relationship to federally recognized tribes, for me, rises a little bit higher. It rises a little bit more in a priority for me. And part of the work that we did with Department of Commerce this year was acknowledging that large relationship and population that we have in the urban communities of Seattle and Spokane and around the rural areas. And what is that relationship with these urban organizations? How do we help our urban Native communities as a state representative and an obligation to that? And how do I honor the sovereign relationship to our federally recognized tribes in that same arm? Again, working together and collaborating. You know, people will often say, oh, it's easy to do the right thing. You just do it. We that work in elected positions know we would love to be able to do the right thing, but it's not always as easy as you may think it is. There is still more education to be taught to my legislative colleagues and to my governor's office and to their cabinet members on who is the Native Americans of Washington State. What is a federally recognized tribe? What is a treaty tribe? What is a non-treaty tribe? What is an unrecognized tribe? How do I fulfill my obligation to a treaty tribe? What is urban organizations? Why don't they live on reservations? Why are they not there? What is my responsibility as a state representative there? So you can tell in my excitement that I have a lot of work to do, but I have the good people such as Chairman Forsman and the 28 chairs to work with them. And I have a great relationship and friendship with Abigail, who teaches me every day how to strengthen my role so I can make sure that every Native American who calls Washington State home is taken care of, and especially those who will call this place home generations from now. I laid a little bit of a pathway for 20 more Native Americans, Chairman Forsman and Abigail, to run for the House of Representatives and the Senate behind me, so we can take our rightful places to make decisions side by side in the state legislature. I'm a little long-winded today, Ernie. I'm a little excited.
It's okay. That's okay. Again, you're juggling real life and this particular moment for us. So thank you for that. I want to go back to something you mentioned that is very critically important that I find myself in my job, and that's the government to government responsibility, and how that is different than the DEI work. There is a distinction between DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and government to government responsibility. And we don't want to confuse DEI work with the necessity to say, as a proxy to our duty on a government-to-government relationship.
Absolutely. And I lean towards Chairman Forsman and Abigail to join me in answering this question because it's very important, especially now. Equity and diversity in DEI work has really risen as the new forthcoming situation that we need to address. But let me be really clear. Federally recognized tribes have a federal agreement and they have a relationship with the state as a sovereign nation also. The government-to-government relationship that's being conducted with the 29 tribes and the 3 tribes who have territorial treaty rights within Washington state must be honored by the state legislature and must be honored by the government. This means my elected relationship within the state legislature is with Chairman Forsman as an elected to elected. My relationship with a lobbyist or with a staff person within the federally recognized tribe is based on how that federally recognized tribe honors and says this relationship is going to move forward. My relationship with my communities of color is in a relationship from an elected official to a community, which is quite different. The sovereign nations are sovereign nations. The the communities of color are a community relationship based in my view book. And I would hope that my colleagues, Chairman Forsman and Abigail, might rise above it because might rise and answer that question because we have to rise above your question and to be able to share that with our communities of color and with our federally recognized tribe. But my priority is to protect my government-to-government relationship with Chairman Forsman.
Thank you, Rep. Lekanoff, for making clear that distinction. Chairman Forsman, if you wouldn't mind offering kind of a follow-up comment on how you, as the chair of the Squamish tribe, navigate these different levels of intergovernmental relationship, whether it's a local government, state government, federal government, and even the other governments of other tribes. Would you mind offering some comment on how difficult that can be, how challenging it can be, and what are some of your strategies for positive outcomes to those relationships?
Well, I kind of think back to Chief Seattle, and when what he experienced. He was a young man pre-contact, or a young boy, I should say, pre-contact, and then experiences contact. Then he experiences an economic shift through the introduction of the fur trade. He experiences a religious conflict with the introduction of Catholicism and the Christian religions that were competing with his traditional belief systems and maybe complementing it in some way, but that's a whole nother discussion. And then language, changing the language, introduction of Chinook jargon, and then eventually some issues regarding international issues. So he was doing a lot of diplomacy, right? He was having to deal with the British, the King George men. He was having to deal with the Americans. They called them Bostids after the term Boston. So I kind of see him as kind of establishing that, and other leaders like Pat Keenum from Tulalip, who's from the Snohomish, and others, Chalicum was the Squamish. They're actually kind of mediating between tribes and traders, and then eventually, settlers and pioneers that came in. So once a treaty is signed, we have to first, like I said, survive the assimilation, and then the remnants of our government that we're still going, and the remnants of our belief systems that were still alive were reconstituted. And then we went out and said, hey, you know what? We have treaty rights to fishing. We have treaty rights to healthcare and education, and all these things were promised to us. And everybody around us has gotten wealthy, and everybody around us is achieving all these things, and we're left behind. And we need to, try to restore that relationship. So a lot of the work that I do is around natural resource and cultural resource protection. Of course, the Bolt decision and its legal adjudication helps in that we have, early on we were exerting ourselves because, hey, what, you have to address your impacts to salmon fishing. You have to address how you manage your fleet, and you need to make sure that we have a harvestable, right? It doesn't say half the fish; it's just a harvestable fish. So that's after escapement. That's after so many fish have swum up the river, hopefully, or into the ecosystem. And then we split that in half, so we have to meet and figure out what that term harvestable is. So a lot of our work was done with United States, with, Alaska, Oregon, Canada, a lot of different places. So a lot of that early work was done. So a lot of the work that we do now was government to government is related to protecting our water quality. So we work with, Kitsap County, King County, City of Seattle, United States Navy, a lot of these different relationships. So one of the things that has to happen, and Billy Frank Jr., who was a big inspiration to many of us who went to jail 43 times protecting this right, was instrumental in establishing this Bolt decision and its subsequent adjudication by the Supreme Court. Said, you got to tell your story, because the problem is you have people coming in and they inherit, through, whether it's a Navy captain or a mayor or a engineer or whatever, inherit this trust responsibility. We call it the trust responsibility. The Indians trusted the federal government to honor and protect their treaty rights. The Bolt decision is called the United States versus Washington. United States versus Washington State. The United States sued the Washington State to preserve our treaty rights because they signed the treaty and they are there to protect us. So we call that the trust responsibility. And so we're pushing on that, and we have to teach these people, new people, all the time about that and what they were called. Because when they raise their right hand, especially the federal officials, to honor the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I've taken the oath. I'm a former presidential appointee. That you're basically saying you're going to protect Article 6 of the Constitution that says all treaties negotiated by the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. They don't say supreme very often in the Constitution. So we've educated, the one thing I'll just kind of end with this is we had a Navy captain came in and we had a dispute, and it really was a cultural resource dispute, actually, which he talked about the dispute that we had over the recognition of lands as sacred to us. And he said, "Hey, when I took this class on tribal consultation, and I learned that when I took the oath, I said I'd uphold the treaties. So therefore, we got to go with the tribe on this one." I was like, wow, he was paying attention. So, that's a lot of what we have to do. And I'm sure, thanks to both Abigail and Deb, because they have to do this all the time with the people they work with, not their clients necessarily, but I know with the people that you guys have intergovernmental relationships with, and also in the state legislature as well. So it's just work that we have just resigned to doing, and Billy's always been an inspiration to me on that. So thank you. Hoya Chud, I'm finished.
Thank you, Chairman Forsman. Again, living in that sustainable way, educating, sharing, again, not just about just the lifestyle, but also the responsibility, the trust responsibility to uphold those resources that continue to support our tribal communities so that we can continue to live in that way, is something that I think is one of the real challenges around education of our partners, again, walking in both worlds. And we see that when we're not living in a sustainable way, when we don't have that balance, we end up unhealthy. We end up unhealthy land. We end up with unhealthy people. And and again, going to Abigail, to comment about, this challenge of, again, we can start talking a bit about the impacts of the pandemic as a result of perhaps even climate change. But we know that the pandemic is here, and the role that you guys have played in battling the pandemic. But I would ask you to, kind of think about more of again, the advocacy that you have for Native health at a national level, of course, locally, and how you continue to do that work. I'd like to hear your thoughts, please.
Sure. It's such a great question and really just follows up. And the chairman just did an incredible job of explaining what trust responsibility is. And so I'm an enrolled citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. I hold dual citizenship with the United States as a United States citizen and as a tribal citizen. My tribal citizenship was well established before there was a United States. And as a tribal citizen, the federal trust responsibility to me as a tribal citizen did not end because I'm not on my reservation. And in fact, as we look at the intertribal population here, so here at the Seattle Indian Health Board, we serve more than 270 different tribal affiliations within our healthcare services. Why is that happening? Why are there such an intertribal gathering here in Seattle? Well, there was a policy, an assimilation policy by the US government that took Native people out of their reservations and placed them into large cities across the United States, originally 16, and they expanded that. And their intention was to assimilate us into modern society in a way that separated us from our culture, our lands, our languages, all of those things. And Seattle was one of those original relocation cities. So I had a relative who was removed in the 60s from the Pawnee Nation. He came here. He was given 3 months at the Green Turtle Hostel down on First Avenue. And after that, he was kicked out. He was provided no job training that they had promised. And he became homeless, living what was then Skid Row, which was almost all homeless American Indian Alaska Native people, for about a year before he hitchhiked back to Pawnee, Oklahoma. As a result of these policies, we have generations of homelessness. And in fact, here at Seattle Indian Health Board, we have families that are 5 generations of homelessness directly linked to their first relative who was taken in that program. In addition to that, we have Native people who this is their land and they were displaced from. We have the removal of people, the fish wars. I definitely recommend you reading about the Bolt decision. If you haven't ever heard of that before, there's some really great resources online to understand more about the Bolt decision. And what we fight for is beyond equity, just like Representative Lekanoff said. We are fighting for the treaty rights of our people, for regardless of where we live, there are still treaty and trust responsibilities, particularly within healthcare, to provide quality healthcare for our people. And so we are constantly fighting for that to be upheld. We did it during the pandemic. As a tribal public health authority, that means that I should be treated like a county or a state in regarding to getting data to understand what's happening within our population of people. I couldn't get the CDC to give me the data I have a legal right to. Even though I'm an urban Indian program, I have a legal right to that data. It took 2 congressional hearings, a Politico news article, and a letter from 26 members of Congress for them to give me a sliver of the data that we were asking for. And out of that came a report I titled Data Genocide, where we are looking at the elimination of American Indians, Alaska Natives, and data, which is purposefully done in the systems that have been set up. It eliminates us in the data. And then when that data is used, when folks like Chairman Forsman and others are fighting for resource allocation, they use data that doesn't have a true count of our population. And as a result, we get less resources. We see that in the work that I do as part of the ongoing attempt to eliminate us and that treaty and trust responsibility. So we have been fighting day and night to ensure that that treaty responsibility is upheld. And then locally, as an organization that serves people locally, we have, I would say I probably serve some of the folks who are related to Representative Lekanoff and related to Chairman Forsman. We are an intertribal facility. Is that, we at the city level, at the county level, are always trying to fight to ensure that when we talk about equity, when we look at this disproportionate impact, I want to acknowledge the incredible grief in our community right now, not only here locally, but internationally, regarding the discovery of 215 bodies of children in a residential school, or what is like a boarding school here in the United States, where they took our kids for no other reason they were Indian, and many of them died there. They just discovered a mass grave in British Columbia, and all of our communities are in mourning as a result of that. Were we surprised the mass grave existed? No. That in itself is devastating, and we deal with the impacts of that in the trauma our people experience. In our elders program here at the Seattle Indian Health Board, 60% of all of our elders in our program went to a school exactly like the one that killed all those children. And we work to help heal their trauma and give them the resources. And we fight to ensure there are equitable processes, both the treaty and trust responsibility. And then when we talk about equity, how our people have been impacted, the way we have been targeted for elimination, the way we have been targeted for removal from land, the way we were targeted to take away our language and cultures and attempt to kill the Indian and save the man, which was a real motto that they had. Our people have experienced a lot of trauma, and they cope with that in a variety of different ways. Some ways are not as helpful or as good as others. And so we had a contract with the city of Seattle very recently where we are serving homeless American Indians, Alaska Native, who are 10 times more likely to be homeless in King County than white folks. And we would provide services, get them tents, get them into different services that they needed, try to get them out of and get them housed if that's what they wanted to do. Well, the city unexpectedly and without our permission added on to our contract that we would assist with the homelessness sweeps. And we refused. We are not going to displace our people and become part of the harmful processes that we know and can track are hurting our people, are literally killing our people. We weren't going to do that. And the city added it to our contract and did not give us an option. They just said, you have to do this. And it was an add-on after we had to sign the original contract. We said no. That is our fight for equity. We said no, and we have refused to do that. We've had to use the news media. We're having negotiations with the city right now. Unfortunately, not all of the other urban Indian programs were able to say no because they needed those resources, and they're just going to kind of maneuver their way around. At the Seattle Indian Health Board, whenever we have the ability to fight, we will. And I also want to acknowledge that some of the other urban Indian organizations, they didn't have that same ability, and we want to support them in any way they can. And then other folks like Mother Nation, who serve sexual assault and domestic violence survivors, they just outright said, no, we're ending it with the city right now. We're in negotiations with them. These are equity issues that are attempting us to hurt our own people, and we refuse to have that happen. And we're going to fight from an equity perspective to ensure that we can serve them well. So all of these fights are happening all around us, all of the time. Somebody asked me one time, I was like, what's the best part about being a Native person? I was like, well, I know who I am. I know my responsibility. I know who I'm responsible to. I know those things. And also being an Indian is really hard, because when I saw what was coming out of those children who were in a mass grave, which means they had an open hole they were just throwing babies into as young as 3 years old, I cried for 3 hours because my father's family went to those schools. My mother's family went to those schools, and we had people that never came back. And so that trauma that we're experiencing is ongoing, and we have to have the ways that are culturally appropriate and culturally specific to pray, to sing, to write, to create that helps us overcome those traumas. And we need these funders like the city of Seattle in this example, who is not only not giving us the resources properly, but is expecting us to harm our own people. We need them to look at their structures that have been built on institutional and structural racism, and they need to reevaluate themselves to understand that as Native health providers, as Native providers, as Native people who love our people, we need to have the flexibility to overcome the trauma that was perpetuated against us and is ongoing so our people can be healthy and whole. Because I don't want my sons weeping for the things that happened to me.
Thank you, Abigail. Powerful words. And again, yes, that acknowledgement of the devastation in that British Columbia community to that tribal, that First Nations community up there. Thank you for bringing that forward and acknowledging that pain that we're all experiencing. Indian country is raw right now because of that news and that realization. Again, we were well aware that those existed, and it's unfortunate that a tribe had to go in and prove it themselves, that this was not on the crown, this was not on the Catholic Church, this was not on anyone else other than a tribe to go in and prove that existence and that occurrence. So I'm honored to be here with you all in this fight. I want to, we've got about just over 15 minutes left, and I kind of want to wrap it up with just a few comments about, some of the again, one of the real warriors, these 21st century warriors that we're seeing emerge. And that is, the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. Just an incredibly uplifting story and so positive. And I want to ask, just for a few comments from each of you, with her position leading the Bureau of Indian Affairs, do you think it'll help foster a cohesive and positive approach between the BIA and tribal activity, and especially here in Washington State? Chairman Forsman, I want to go to you as our chairman.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I think it's going to be very fruitful. I always try to keep my expectations at a level that are reasonable, because she does, work for the entire nation. It's like Representative Lekanoff mentioned about her role. She's very steeped in her role as, working for tribes for the past couple decades and all, but she does represent her own district too. And I think that everybody's got to remember that the interior is for the entire nation. So, but having American Indian in the position is extremely exciting, and one of her caliber is extremely exciting. So she's very familiar with the relationship between all the interior agencies, including the BIA, and the tribes, and what the needs are out there. So we're looking forward to, and have already been seeing, increased consultation and reversal of some of the previous administration's actions that were harmful to Indian country, and looking forward to a more balanced approach to managing the trust responsibility than we've had in the past. I think that it's important to remember that, the tribes, are, work on a bipartisan manner. We work with Republicans too. So we, of course, have a relationship with the entire U.S. Congress. So we try to educate everybody, and we've actually have made some alliances with people on both sides of the aisle. So it's very important to remember that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Abigail, I'd like to come back to you with your thoughts on Deb Haaland and how she's going to be able to support your work. You might be able to see the benefit of her being in that position.
Yeah, representation matters. That's what we saw with Secretary Haaland immediately coming into her position. I do a lot of work on the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, where Seattle and Washington, in studies that I've conducted, had some of the highest rates. And Secretary Haaland, in the very first 2 weeks of being in her position, established an office, the very first of its kind, established an office to address missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. Representation matters, and she showed it right there. And the chairman is absolutely correct that we have to acknowledge, and I always think my expectations are she works for the government. She can also do things like this, and a problem that has been acknowledged. And as a result of bipartisan support within Congress, specifically the advocacy of Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, who really led and pushed and made the Not Invisible Act, the Savannah's Act. She was a major part of that. It wouldn't have happened without her. That we have this bipartisan support. And as a result of that, Secretary Haaland was able to establish such an office. And there was no resistance from folks on either side of the political aisle. And so we can look towards Indigenous leadership here in Washington State. And I have to just raise my hands in gratitude to Auntie Julie Johnson, who has been one of the people, she's probably the person in Washington State over the last years, who has been pushing forward Native people into running for office, public office, everywhere from school boards to, she was part of with Representative Lekanoff. And here in Seattle, we have 2 Indigenous people running for mayor. We have and are working towards representation, and Secretary Haaland, being the first Native person in that position, is blazing a path forward that also takes us as tribal people, providing the advocacy, the resources, and the education across the Biden administration and across Congress to support her in her work as she moves forward and representation, not only for Indian country, but for the entire nation. Again, the health of Native people is the health of this nation.
Thank you, Abigail. And, again, representation matters, and it's amazing how we can go right to Representative Lekanoff as the sole Native American representative in the state legislature for her thoughts on the importance of Deb Haaland and her position.
Oh my gosh, representation matters. You're absolutely right, Ernie. I was part of the 38 women who ran for office in 2018 with Secretary Haaland and Congresswoman Davids. It was an incredible moment to watch 38 women run across the nation for lieutenant governor, for congressional seats. I've run and got to witness Paulette Jordan running for office and fighting to be able to have a seat at the table as a Native American woman, making decisions that impact our communities. I believe representation is really important for us in our Native American communities. I think it's important for us, Chairman Forsman and Abigail, to advocate for our Native American people to run for office, to have a seat at the table, because inside you can do things such as Deb Haaland of setting up the MMIW office, which we've been fighting for so long. It's the honoring of the federally recognized tribes and our urban organizations to work with them, but it's what you're able to do inside as an elected office. Imagine, Chairman Forsman and Abigail, what I could do if I had 10 more of me sitting in the state legislature, in the R's and the D side, in the House and the Senate side, how monumental this partnership and relationship would look like as we start making more informed decisions together, as we have people who think and make decisions like we do. I'm just excited to reach back to the hands behind me and say, step up with me and represent, step up with me and be fierce. Take your knowledge and experience and make those decisions together, because I truly think we can start to overcome our differences and become better leaders in Washington State when our tribes step up and our Native American and our urban organizations step up with us, Abigail, because when Indian people are healthy and we're being prosperous in our economy, as will this state and as will this nation. So I'm really excited. When one of my first calls when I won my election, as I was walking down the streets of Bellingham, and we were here wearing heels at that time, Abigail, was Deb Haaland calling me to congratulate me. She was one of my first national Native American women who stood up with me in my campaign as I stood up with her. And we climbed this hill together. So to stand up and to push her up and clear a little bit of branches for her is quite an honor. So representation matters.
Don't sell yourself short, Representative Lekanoff. That racial mascot bill is we're all benefiting. My kids went to a border school that had a Native American mascot and felt dehumanized, and they expressed that, and it never went anywhere. Even as we expressed it to the school board, we expressed it to staff, school leadership, the community. So again, thank you for that. That is tremendously appreciated. And I know that you mentioned, Rep. Lekanoff, that you may have to drop from us a little early. So I want to go back to you real quick and ask your thoughts. And this is going to be a question for everybody, just as we wrap up today. How can you offer some advice on how non-Native people, allies, advocates, and I'd like to even call out accomplices at time as we do good work, how can they support you in your work and Native communities in general?
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Seattle City Club for being here. Thank you for your organization and support. Jeff, thank you for this invitation of bringing Ernie forward and inviting my esteemed colleagues, Tribal Chairman Leonard Forsman, and my wonderful, incredible friend and leader and partner, Abigail Echohawk. I really believe that the Seattle City Club can continue to advocate and support our Native American issues across the aisle in both a Republican and a Democratic Party. And remember, our Native American issues that we're facing are your issues. We're your friends, we're your neighbors. Our children drink the same cool and clean water as you do. We're the ones standing at the bus stop. We're the ones standing in Starbucks. We're the ones going to Walmart. We're the ones going fishing, hiking. We're the ones standing next to you every day. I would also, my second guidance to the Seattle City Club, understand your relationship as a Washingtonian and honor the federally recognized tribes and the sovereignty of those tribes. Understand the 29 federally recognized tribes and the 3 who have territorial treaty rights. Know your history and share your history. Lean to the person who's sitting next to the coffee shop, which may be 6 feet apart, and you may still be wearing a mask. Share your story, share your acknowledgement, share what you know. To my urban organizations and my thousands of members who look like me and sound like me, who live in urban areas, get to know the work of the urban organizations, contribute to the work that they're doing, reach out and ask them what you can do to help them. But follow the lead of what their messaging is. This is really important. You can become an advocate for a tribe or for an urban organization, but don't think that you know what's best for them. If you want to honor a federally recognized tribe, understand and follow what their messaging is. They will tell you what they need. Same with Abigail in the organizations. Don't think you know what's best for them. Honor the teachings of Abigail and the knowledge of her leadership in her organizations. They will share the message with you. Be part of our family, but acknowledge that to honor the family, remember Abigail, we have to follow the aunties before us who have blessed us with those teachings. Because if you don't, you'll get the stink eye from the auntie. We've got it a couple of times. And I say that with a smile to Ernie and to Leonard. Thank you for having me here today. Please know, Jeff, my door is always open. I'm always happy to come back and have a discussion with your organization. And thank you for having me here.
Mitch Wawanen, Yamago, Miigwech, Representative Lekanoff. Abigail, any closing thoughts on, again, how our non-native allies, advocates, and again, I like to call it accomplices who are willing to get their hands dirty, how they can stand beside us and assist us in our work?
Absolutely. It's, again, a great way to close. And thank you, Representative, who has just been a dear friend, advocate, and one of those aunties. I always appreciate that. I think it's really important for community members to think about how they move beyond being an ally into accomplice. And so what does that mean? And it means taking action. I know that right now, everybody's like, it's really the vogue thing to do is to do a land acknowledgement. I struggle with that because I don't see any action behind those. So think about what is your responsibility to the federally recognized tribes, the urban Indian programs. How are you contributing? What responsibility are you taking for the land that you are on? It may be going to the chairman's incredibly beautiful museum and purchasing art from their artists out there. And it may be going down to the Snoqualmie's, now owned by the Snoqualmie Nation, 8th generation, where you can buy native made, not native inspired. There are opportunities to contribute to our economy, and also to recognize that the Washington State tribes here are an incredible driver of the economy of Washington State. They are the employers. They are the folks contributing to their local economies, and thinking about their economic enterprise as key to the economics of your community and how you contribute by accessing their businesses. You can also donate and work, volunteer. Look, when we're, places like the Seattle Indian Health Board where I'm at, we are a nonprofit. We really need the resources that donations can bring for us. We need we used to prior to COVID-19, and I'm sure it will come up again. We've needed volunteers. We've needed, used clothes to give to our domestic violence and sexual assault programs. Follow our organizations on social media. Look up our websites. See what resources that you can be a part of. And the other is to think about how you are also a good steward of the land that you're on. And as somebody whose community has been deeply impacted by climate change, both on my Pawnee side and my Athabascan side, think about how you can limit your impact on the environment. As Native people, we always tell ourselves as in relationship to the land, not as owners of, but in a partnership with. So think about how you are in a partnership with the land and what you have and should be contributing. And part of that is upholding the sovereign treaty rights of tribal nations for subsistence, hunting, and fishing, the regulation of their lands, and doing whatever they takes to ensure that this land is available for those 7 generations look forward into the future. So step up. Don't just be an ally and say, I support Native communities. What is your opportunity for action?
Thank you, Abigail. Real quick, You know, according to Washington Indian Gaming Association, a study sponsored by them with a Harvard economist, tribes collectively are the 8th largest employer in the state, with 70% of those employees being non-native. So, you know, let's put some data behind your comment there. And let me turn it over to Chairman Forsman, just asking for him to kind of wrap up final thoughts on how to be an ally, an advocate, and an accomplice.
Well, thank you, Abigail and Deb, for, you know, those statements. Really spot on, and you know, took a lot of what I was probably going to say. One thing to add on to that is that we're indigenous people, so we aren't going to move. We're going to stay. We're here for the long haul. We've been here for thousands of years, and we aren't going anywhere. So unlike other, you know, business owners and operators and assets to the economy, we will be here. We're not going to relocate. So, and we really appreciate the work of our urban populations. And we've been partnered, you know, in the past, we've partnered together and advocated for each other. So I really appreciate that. And just acknowledge the City Club for putting this together. Seattle is, of course, a super important place for us. We fish there. We have cultural ties there. We have traditional ancestral ties there, and look forward to you know, a continued relationship with the City of Seattle on a government basis, and also the Port of Seattle, and also King County. So we're continuing to be engaged in that, and everybody pay attention and vote. That's very important. So register to vote and vote. Every election's important. So appreciate you giving us this opportunity here today. Thank you. Well, Ted, I'm finished.
I just want to say thank you again for this opportunity to sit alongside you, Chairman Forsman, Representative Lekanoff, and Miss Abigail Acknowledgment. You know, again, I'm inspired. It's easy in Indian country when you look for those reasons as to why you were born Native. It's easy to find reason as to what your, you know, the purpose of your life and what your life's mission is. And I want to thank the Seattle City Club for this opportunity to facilitate this conversation. It really was my honor, and I shared with Jeff that I was a bit intimidated by, you know, again, the high caliber of folks that were assembled around the table today, and I hope I served you all well. Jeff, I will turn it back over to you to wrap it up and close it up for us.
Well, thank you, Ernie, and thanks again to our panelists, Abigail, Chairman Forsman, Representative Lekanoff. We've been very lucky to hear from you today and very honored by your presence. So thank you again for your generosity, spending your time with us today. I also want to thank all the participants who hung around, and I'm sure they got a lot out of this conversation today. We have a recording. We'll be making this available for everyone in a couple weeks after our last webinar. I also need to thank our sponsor, Civic Bootcamp sponsor, Alaska Airlines, for their generosity and helping us put these events on. At that, thank you so much again, and take care and stay safe.